Foundation for Conservation summit called Ensuring the Wild. And I've got a few announcements to make and people to introduce, so if you'll bear with me. My name is Bryant. I live in Kingsville, Texas. Species. So our central mission is to educate the public, to create a public awareness, if you will, about an issue that we take very seriously. And this whole program today is developed around that. I want to introduce the Todd Olson group. I don't know if Todd's here. Yeah, there he is in the back. His office helped organize all this and did the program, and they're helping us along the way. Our honorary trustees are Kay Betty Hutchinson, Honorable Pete Laney, and the Honorable Kay Betty Hutchinson, and Honorable Pete from Van Horn to Victoria, from Amarillo and Albany to Falfurrias, Texas. So they're all over the place in Texas. I want to introduce those that are here today, our trustees. Jimmy Ruth Evans is here. She's from San Antonio, Texas, but really from Rock Springs, if you know her very well. Jimmy Ruth, thank you. Teal Clayberg from Kingsville, Texas is here in there. Margaret Martin from Bernie. Saw Margaret earlier. There she is right there. Molly McAdams from Seguin. There's Molly in the back. Ellen Randall from Houston. I hugged her neck. She's right here. Mark Ray from Corpus Christi. I didn't hug his neck. Didn't plan to. Sorry, Mark. Dale Smith is from Amarillo. Oh, there's Dale. Thank you for being here, Dale. Are there any trustees I missed that are here today? Thank you all for being a part of our organization. The sponsors for this summit are Audubon, Texas, the Coastal Conservation Association, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. So they've helped us along the way. The goal of our organization, of the foundation, is to create a public awareness about the fact that the fish and wildlife of our state belong to the people of Texas. Our tenets are that our fish and wildlife are always held in the public trust. Our waterways, our beaches should be held in the public trust. I want to turn Bastrop State Park over to developers. I don't think that would be a good idea to have pawn shops, strip malls, and other things in Bastrop State Park. By the same token, we don't believe that we should turn wildlife species over, fish and wildlife species over to private ownership, that those belong in the public trust. Thank you for being here today. You know, when we're thinking about the organization of this meeting, really and truly we should be over there in DK Royal Stadium with 100,000 people to talk to. That's where this ought to be held. But instead of doing that, we decided to focus on the people that really care about our fish and wildlife, number one, and that have influence in the lives of others that they work with, NGOs, people that can talk to other people about the issues that you're going to hear about today. So that those are that's the reason you're here today, and thank you for being here. Our program is 5 speakers who are experts in their field. They hold positions across North America, if you will. We're going to do this the way we are going to organize today. Every speaker is going to be given their time on the podium. We're going to hold all questions at the end, and we're going to have a panel down here, and then John, you're going to help us on the panel, if you will. So all the speakers will be up here to answer questions for about a half an hour or so after all the speakers have made their presentations. You're going to hear about the roots of conservation, the threats to really the private property issue of threats to privatization, and the role of private landowners. With that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and I'm going to serve as your moderator today. Shane Patrick Mahoney. I've known Shane for over 2 decades, a good friend of mine. He is president and CEO of Conservation Visions. He is the voice, I think, in North America for the public trust doctrine and the North American model for conservation. He's the former executive director of the Sustainable Development and Strategic Science for the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I met Shane 20 years ago in the Boone and Crockett Club, where we both served as professional members. Interesting enough, he keynoted the Cesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute, we had our 25th anniversary back in '06, and Shane provided our keynote for that, that symposium that day. So with that, help me welcome Dr. Shane Mahoney from New York.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here. I have, over the last 20 or 25 years, spent a great deal of time in the United States of America. And over that, it's an unending source of inspiration writers. Quite extraordinary to walk through any bookstore, certainly any library, and see Civil War or a position of great respect for the United States. And I know your history and your culture well enough to know that, as with all nations, imperfections exist. So my opinion is not uninformed. I would say that it's quite well informed. And thus my respect for the people of this country and what this nation stands for is worth more than if it was not informed. Part of the respect that I have for this nation, an important part, is what the United States of America has given to the world in terms of conservation leadership and conservation policy. It is disappointing at one level for all of us, I think, who are engaged in this business, to realize that the vast majority of your citizens do not understand or are not conversant with or do not know a great deal about the conservation history of this nation and what you have given to the world. And it is left to a small group of us to try as much as possible to reach out and explain that, along with all the other great things that this country has achieved, perhaps none will be seen in future decades and centuries as being as great as the leadership that this nation provided to the world in the founding of what is now recognized as one of the most successful and most profound conservation systems in the world today. We will learn in the 21st century, people everywhere, in every part of this small globe, we will all come to understand that conservation is no longer just a term to be talked about in comfort or to be debated in some kind of intellectual exercise. We will come to understand that the conservation of natural resources impinges directly and painfully upon our own existences, upon the future of our countries, upon the capacities of our nations, and upon the futures and lives, health and well-being of our children, and especially our grandchildren. This is an inevitable part of the course of human history now. I'm delighted to see up here the sponsors for this event, because in looking at just those that are identified there, there is an inkling of the kind of broad-based support for the conservation of wildlife in the United States that has prevailed now for almost over a century and moving on to a century and a quarter in duration. And at the heart of that conservation movement, which I will speak more about, at the heart of that conservation movement is a very simple idea and a very profound one, but also one that has a history that extends back at least to Roman law, was incorporated in the Magna Carta, became part of English civil law, was brought to the original 13 colonies as a formation of law in this fledgling country, then became strengthened through the Constitution to apply to all of the states, and eventually became recognized as the founding principle of the conservation movement in your country and in Canada, and it is known as the public trust doctrine. So for anybody who wishes to talk about this particular thematic idea, this concept, and view it as somehow a modern kind of phenomenon that has appeared in our midst because of perhaps debates over the future of wildlife should first of all understand, and I mean that all of us should understand that this principle extends back to the Justinian codes of the Romans, and the idea that wildlife should belong to no one personally, but belong to everyone collectively, is embedded in that long intellectual history. This is not some sideshow, ladies and gentlemen. This is not some water cooler debate. This is a fundamental principle that goes back through most of the great upheavals and civilizations in history, from the time of the Greeks, in fact, onward. So we need to understand that, I think, as a principle, because what it suggests to me is that we are dealing with something that has been fundamentally recognized and thought about by a great many intelligent cultures over a great many centuries. It is not something to simply say, oh, well, why don't we just toss that aside and look for something new. It's not just deeply embedded in your country, it has been deeply embedded in law and the approach to wild things, They're called that for a reason. Wild things. That applied to them because they were recognized as special, unique, not something that any individual should own. These principles, as I said, have guided, or this principle has guided the policies and institutions and the laws and the publicly funded science programs, the agencies and organizations, federally and statewide, that have been at the forefront of the conservation of wildlife in our country. And if there is one myth, ladies and gentlemen, if there is one truth, one myth that I would like to see dispelled amongst the people of the world and the people of the United States of America and the people of Canada, all of whom share it in a significant majority, is that wildlife somehow exists by accident. Wildlife does not exist by accident. Wildlife exists particularly today only by virtue of the decisions we make, the decisions we fail to make, or the decisions we defer. Those decisions will determine the fate of all of these wild creatures, from the great whales, to the songbirds, to the great predators of the planet, the brown bears of Kamchatka and the leopards of Namibia. There is no Eden out there, displaced and too foreign, too far a horizon for the human enterprise to ignore or not capture. It will only be by virtue of what we bring, of intellect and passion and commitment and resolve, that will keep them with us. If anybody in this room does not believe that keeping them with us is important to us as human beings, as well as to the natural world, then I believe you're in the wrong place. There can be no doubt, if one studies the North American approach to conservation, that this idea of the public trust, where the responsibility for the management and conservation of wild resources and many other things are placed in the hands of government on behalf of the people. There can be absolutely no doubt that this has driven, shaped, focused, and nurtured the conservation of wildlife in your country for over a century. And if it had not been so, it is hard to imagine how the successes that you have achieved as a nation for wildlife could have even been remotely possible. You hear a lot about this idea of the North American model and the idea that it has somehow been successful. Unfortunately, most of your school children do not know this story, even though one of your greatest presidents of all time was significantly responsible for its launch. One of those individuals who, it was said, he not only represented America, he was America. And one of those presidents in your past who rose to greatness and seems every year inspires another 3 or 4 books of 500 to 1,000 pages, exploring some other aspect of his life. Despite the success and despite this history, it is not a well-known concept in your country, and we in this room ought to change that. And we can. The North American model is based on a series of very well-defined principles, and I call it the North American model. It was essentially born in your country. It became adopted by Canada, one of the very far-sighted ruling on the part of the Canadian political elites. And it has now come to represent the framework by which these two countries, advanced, wealthy, mature democracies, manage to act as custodians for an incredible diversity of wildlife across a landscape of immense scale and diversity. I don't want to spend a lot of time discussing the principles, but the public trust doctrine is obviously the crucial one. In addition to that, there is the idea that we would eliminate markets in wildlife, and that we would base science, or we would base the conservation and management of wildlife on the issue of science, not on people's opinions, not on what people wanted, not on some truth that even emanated from their own personal experience, but something that in addition to all of that will be based on conceptual approaches with trained professionals who would come to study the interactions in nature, the diversity of those interactions, and help explain them in such a way that your people could benefit from the applications of policies that your agencies would develop. There would be no frivolous use of wildlife. There would be no frivolous killing of these great creatures. And there would be democratic access to the opportunities under law to pursue and to harvest them. And your model recognized long before the rest of the world, long, 3/4 of a century almost, certainly half a century before Europe, that wildlife was an international resource that had to be protected by treaty law. These are not small achievements. Just imagine if you wish today to form a treaty over any aspect between Canada and the United States. Think of softwood lumber. Think of lots of things. And think about the work it took to make it, the work it takes to preserve it. Well, over 100 years ago, Canada and the United States forged such an international policy of migratory birds that has led to one of the most astounding wildlife programs in the world, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. There is nothing anywhere in the world that can even touch the hem of the skirt of that model. Born out of this country. So that's all very nice. But what did it achieve? It is extremely difficult for people in our two countries, in Canada and the United States, to understand the dire consequences that faced wildlife at the turn of the 20th century. It is also unbelievable for us to think that in a decade we could take bison, numbering perhaps as many as 30 million, some say far more, to the very brink of extinction. That we could take the passenger pigeon that one time flew in flocks in excess of a couple of billion birds, a single flock, that would darken the skies for days on end in their constant passage over a town or hamlet. And we could destroy them, lose them. All of it based on a rapacious taking of wildlife for personal profit, for personal gain. This is the story of the demise of wildlife in your country. There is no historic debate about this. We know what happened to those species when egret's feathers were worth more than a pound of gold. And we know what would have happened to dozens upon dozens of other species had not the idea of democratic ownership, of public trust doctrine, been initiated, inspired, and instilled in the programs and policies by Theodore Roosevelt and the cadre of other conservation giants that came into this country. If you do not think you could have lost white-tailed deer, as we almost did, or wild turkey, as we almost did, and Canada geese, as we almost did, and wood duck, and pronghorn, and black bear, and mule deer, then read the history of the accounts of what was left. And it was not so long ago, into the 40s and 50s, when people exclaimed in awe and surprise when they would see whitetails returning to parts of the United States of America. And along this way, we rescue them. We build what is unquestionably the most mature, complicated, resilient, and inspiring conservation system in the world. I know the world's conservation systems. I work with the world's conservation systems. What you have here is unbelievable. Even Canada is simply a child in its conservation complexity and structure compared with your country. And the world is recognizing this. Finally recognizing that when the United Nations Commission on the Fate of the World's Resources in the 1960s and 70s and then into the 80s looked at issues and came up with the notion of sustainable development, they didn't realize that wise use or sustainable development was being used by Teddy Roosevelt 50, 60, 70 years before. They thought they'd come up with a new idea. But now, finally, the world is beginning to understand what you have achieved across a century of time and all of the changes that have taken place in your country, the economic, the social, the demographic, the cultural, all of the changes that have taken place on your landscapes in 100 years, and yet this model survives and your wildlife thrives. Thrives so much that it bothers people to see the troops of turkeys in their driveways, bothers people to see the white-tailed deer hanging across the radiators of their cars, bothers people to have to move the geese across before they take their shot at the last hole. From a time of virtual destruction to a time when we as a society can afford to complain that we have too many geese, that we have too many deer, that we might have too many wild turkey, too many predators. It's pretty amazing. So out of this complex system, however, of institutions and laws and policies, I want to emphasize something else. Because at the heart of the debate over the privatization of wildlife and the idea of the economic models that can be derived from them, we all need to stand back and examine the economic juggernaut, the powerhouse of financial exchange that was born out of this North American model where wildlife is left in the public trust. It is well recognized that if anybody in this room could control the currency flow, the business opportunity, the job creation miracle that is recognized as the phenomenon of hunting and recreational fishing, both tied to this model, in North America, that you would control one of the richest companies in the world. Just think about what you've created. Think about the Bass Pros and the Cabela's and the thousands of organizations and businesses that rely on them. The 750,000 to a million American citizens who owe their jobs directly in rural parts of your country to these activities. Think about the billions that have been applied through tax incentives and tax checkoffs and taxes generally applied to this equipment that have gone to benefit the conservation system in your country. Think about the fact that you've managed for this long to maintain, with challenges, yes, but nevertheless you've succeeded in maintaining a funding system for all of this at the state level. No one else in the world has even thought of this. And all of it based on this incredible idea that in a country that constitutionally was and remains an abiding supporter, a constitutionally defined supporter of the notion of private property rights and private land ownership, to suggest in any way that the United States of America cannot have public wildlife and private lands working together is to deny a century of empirical evidence. To suggest that we can replace it and thereby redeem some great cloud drifting across the landscape. Surely no one can view it as a threat. Yet we must, because of what's at stake. Incredible achievements of this North American model. Your incredible achievements. Just think about the number of NGOs in your country associated with conservation. I don't know what the final number is, somebody in this audience may well know, but it's in the tens upon tens of thousands. I spent time in Europe and they'll ask me a question like, so how do you create a DU? I mean, it's like going into a store and seeing a child and they're at a bubblegum machine and they say, how do you create a bubblegum, sir? That's how different it is. That's how vastly different it is. But in your country, you have tens upon tens of thousands of these entities supporting conservation in many different ways, from the Audubon Society to the coastal conservation system, to the array is mind-boggling. And you have built this on the basis that wildlife is owned by everyone. And something that all of us should remember. You know, people often say to me, Shane, a lot of people don't care. And I do believe that we have a problem that too few people care. But I also believe that in the American people, there is this kind of strange, quiet, restive support for these ideas. Because it occurs to me that after Roosevelt left the White House, after establishing wildlife reserves, national forests and national parks and national monuments and all those other things, destroying the commercial aspects of wildlife through various laws like the Lacey Act and other things that were put in place, and after antagonizing almost all of the American political administration, it seems to me that it would have been possible, wouldn't it, for subsequent presidents to have changed what he did. Yet here we sit in 2016, And is anyone seriously proposing we eliminate the national parks of your country? Is anyone seriously proposing that we eliminate all those wildlife refuges? Only a handful are proposing that we return to a commercialized, privatized aspect of wildlife that decimated the nature of this country. Somehow, in you, and in all citizens like you, you may not carry a placard, you may not demonstrate, you may not write your congressman or your senator, but somehow you carry within you a commitment to these ideas. And that is why no president, Democrat or Republican, has ever really dared to try to tear those things down. And I believe that is what keeps us strong. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that we abandon this. I want you to think for a moment what might happen. Do we really believe that under a system where wildlife is privately owned, that the kind of broad-based public concern or support, as quiet as it might be, would exist? Do you think that that army of NGOs, providing their time, volunteerism, their money, their capacities, would be out there storming the ramparts of the challenges to conservation if this resource is owned by private citizens? Do you think that it's going to be possible for people to provide willingly the taxes that have, since 1937, provided billions upon billions of dollars for the conservation of wildlife and the public trust? Do you think they will willingly do so for wildlife that is owned by me or you? It will not stop with deer, ladies and gentlemen. Whenever wildlife attains a commodity value, that commodity value will be realized across a wide array of species. People have raided the gerfalcon nests in Labrador, where I come from, for many years under highly effective clandestine operations because they could sell a single chick, even 20 years ago, for $10,000 to $50,000 US. Wildlife is valuable in many ways. And that's why the idea of having it to oneself and benefiting from it is a realistic notion. Benefits can be derived from wildlife and the ownership of them because they are highly prized and have been throughout their existence. But why? Why would you even consider? Why would your nation, your state, your elected officials, why would they even consider risking unraveling this fabric of success that has been the North American model in your country and in Canada? What is to be gained by this risk to benefit the few at the expense of the many? Wildlife will only be kept in your country because of the collective decisions and the collective support and the collective understanding that they are everyone's. If suddenly any species becomes recognized as just a kind of another domesticated animal, do you expect that species to still inspire people? How inspired are most of us by the domesticated chicken? It is not a surgical precision thing we're talking about. It is something that when you open up this door, an incredibly wide and complicated vista presents itself. You have a century and more of success. And the suggestion is to turn away from that at some scale and open up the doors to the risks that we already have evidence for. This argument in favor of the North American model and the public trust doctrine is not some reactionary thing that says, oh, we can't have change. We can't explore alternatives. We're afraid of change. We know the risks associated with some of these activities. We know the problems of disease transmission and escapes. We know the issues of genetic manipulation and the escapes of those animals and what it might mean, although we haven't explored it fully. Animals taken under private ownership become essentially objects that can be manipulated in any way, like the strange color variants of wildebeest and other species that are being created in South Africa today and alarming the international world of wildlife conservationists. You don't change a few aspects of an animal in captivity without changing all kinds of other aspects that you don't see. But once that animal escapes to the wild and distribution of its gene pattern begins, the implications for wildlife in terms of the integrity of wild species, but also the health of wild species, becomes a crapshoot. None of us know. Species that have been with us for millions and millions and millions of years. This is worth it? This can even be entertained? Creation of markets for wildlife have a history. And those creation of markets are not only huge debates in your country, they are huge debates in the world. Creating markets, legal, enforced as best we can, almost inevitably leads to markets that are illegal that we cannot enforce. There is a reason why the debate over the sale of elephant ivory and the sale of rhino horn exists, even amidst the great conservation challenges we face. We know that markets are incredibly problematic for wildlife and have been. We have to keep the public of the United States of America on the side of wildlife, ladies and gentlemen. Your time, my time, it will come and it will pass. As it did for Roosevelt, as it did for all those other giants who led this movement, and the many whom we don't know. But the model that they incepted, the model that they conceived, and in turning their back on the commercialization of wildlife, that model has endured now for a remarkable period of time. And today it seems that only more good can come out of it as more organizations are founded and as greater economic opportunity is realized through the conservation of these resources. And please don't forget in your wealth. Please don't forget in your wealth that that model has also provided to 40 million Canadians and Americans every single year who choose to do it, the opportunity to harvest organic wild protein from the landscapes and waters that have been protected under this model. And understand too, that it goes back as far as 1842 when the Supreme Court of your country decided that over a battle involving oyster harvests, that access to wild nature should be for everyone. 1842. You have an extraordinarily proud culture in this state. I come to Texas pretty regularly now, and I have a lot of friends, and I have a lot of supporters in this state. You have done extraordinary things with your wildlife resources. And you have done it in one of the most intensely proud private rights, private land ownership cultures, even for America. And you stand, therefore, in this long lineage of American legacy. You have found a way to combine two good things in a way that benefits a great many people, when you could have easily, in this state, decided to have gone another route even 100 years ago and taken wildlife onto yourselves as private landowners. You are deeply, deeply, deeply invested in this idea. And so you stand in an unbroken line with the giants who built the legacy of your country and your state in this regard, of the people like Roosevelt and Muir and Grinnell and Audubon and Darling and Leopold and Carson. All of that is at stake. All of that is at risk. We cannot put the web back in the spider, ladies and gentlemen. Or as Lincoln said, you cannot mend broken eggs. This debate is not going away. It is now, in my mind, the most fundamental debate we have in conservation in this country. There are differing views, as there always are, on issues of substance. But the arbitration of these ideas must be on who benefits and why. Will, under a scheme where wildlife in America and Canada is privatized, in part or in whole, will that be the mechanism that will provide for the generations unborn of American citizens the best opportunities they have to enjoy wildlife? This is one of the first countries in the world to place in the rhetoric of its major political doctrines this constant reminder that resources only belong to us when we are here and must be passed to those who are not even here yet, in the same condition or better than we found them. Are these grotesque giants that are created by marketplace demands? Is the commodification of wildlife? Is the risk of disease and alienation of the broad public of America in its quiet support for doing the right thing for wildlife? Is that worth it? I believe the United States of America will come to understand that the conservation model that it conceived, fought for, and implemented against great odds and bitter disputes on the part of those who gained personally from the sale and slaughter of wildlife and use of wildlife. You will come to understand that it has been one of the greatest achievements of your country. A country who has had more than its share of extraordinary achievements. Let us draw the line on this. And let's have this proud state where 95% of the land is owned by private citizens. Let it be here that finally there's a statement to say, no, we will not go there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. Outstanding. Just what I needed to hear. I appreciate you mentioning the topic of the slippery slope, because I think that's what we're on, in my view. We have a number of other speakers today that are going to follow up on some of these topics. The next speaker, who will speak about the privatization of fish and wildlife across the United States, the importance of public stewardship of fish and wildlife resources, is Dr. Fidel Hernandez. Fidel is a native of Brackenville, Texas. He grew up on a ranch where his dad was foreman. He learned to love the great outdoors and the wildlife that lived there by this great experience of growing up on a ranch. He got his PhD at Texas A&M Kingsville when we were in a joint program with A&M. He's been a scientist at the Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute since the day he graduated. We weren't going to let him get away. He served on a Fulbright Fellowship 2 years ago in Punta Arenas, Chile. I thought you were on vacation all that time.
I was.
You were. Today he's representing the Wildlife Society, which is, he's on the national board of what we call the Council, which is the Wildlife Society. It's the largest body of wildlife professionals and biologists and scientists in the world. Over 12,000 members nationwide. And actually in Canada too, Shane, sorry about that, and Mexico and other countries. So Fidel will come up and talk about the threat of privatization across the United States.
Thanks, Fred, for the introduction. I must admit that I always get a little nervous presenting. It's not so much the topic this time or being in front of an audience public speaking, but I see that there's cameras going here. And I have a tendency of sticking my foot in my mouth. My parents are from Mexico, and I learned Spanish is my native language. I learned English through the public school system. And so I'm thinking Spanish and speaking English, and I transpose vowels and consonants and end up oftentimes coming up with some very embarrassing combinations. I'll tell you one that's PG that I can say. Most of them tend not to be PG. But anyways, I was introducing this professor that was going to give a guest lecture in one of my classes. And her last name is Ledbetter, and I accidentally called her Bedwetter. So I have plenty more, but unfortunately I can't tell you all, at least not right now. Maybe during the break I can fill you in. So I was asked to talk on the importance of public stewardship and what it means for fish and wildlife resources here in the United States. And really, if you look at this question, it boils down to who owns wildlife? Is it the citizens of the United States, the state or federal government, or private individuals? And as we delve into this question, we'll have to look more closely into each one of these topics, and I'll approach my topic from a socio-ecological perspective. Shane talked a little bit about the public trust doctrine, and I'll just very briefly highlight those since he talked about many of its features. But then I'll go into the changing demographics of the United States and what that means for wildlife as a public resource and also with the threat of privatization. And then lastly, talk about the role that private landowners play in this question of who owns wildlife. So first of all, looking at the public trust doctrine. As many of y'all know, and as Shane mentioned, wildlife belong to the people. They're entrusted to the government for their care and their management, and it's both for present and for future generations. And we often believe, we hear this public trust doctrine more and more, especially in classes and conservation classes at university, but we fail to acknowledge, as Shane mentioned, that this concept goes into antiquity. Here we have a quote that says, "By law of nature, these things are common to all mankind, the air, the running water, the sea, and consequently the shore of the sea. No one therefore is forbidden to approach it." Anybody know who said that? Those were the Romans, or the Emperor Justinian back in the 500 year AD. He actually said that, and it was based off of Greek law, or the Institutes and Journals of Gaius, he was a Roman jurist. And so the Greeks codified this law, the Romans built on it with Justinian, then the Magna Carta further elaborated on it, and with the Magna Carta, among many other things, it basically limited the king's power to grant resources, or wildlife resources to any particular individual. Fast forward into the 1800s here in the United States, and the same concept that started with the Greeks, the Romans, and now into the United States was at the forefront of a U.S. Supreme Court case, Martin versus Fidel. Basically, Martin owned some land or some river along New Jersey River. He was interested in harvesting oysters. He wanted to exclude all others from access to this river as well as to the oyster resource. And basically, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against this. It was this ruling against private access and sole access to this section of the New Jersey River that became known as the public trust doctrine, and basically established common law that no one owned wildlife. It belonged to the people, and it was entrusted to the government. And it forms one of the basic tenets of what is known as the North American wildlife model that Shane mentioned. First and foremost, that public is held in public trust, that the commerce of wildlife is regulated, or the elimination of markets, that hunting and fishing laws are created through a public process. Also, that everyone has opportunity to fish and hunt, a democracy of hunting or of fishing. That anglers and conservations will help fund this. You have the Pittman-Robertson Act, the Dingell-Johnson Act, that create enormous amounts of money and have since their establishment for conservation. That wildlife is an international resource, and then lastly, that science is a basis for policy. And so we were to look at wildlife conservation in the United States, we basically can boil it down to this. The ownership belongs to the people, to the citizens of this country. The management rests either in state or the federal government, depending on whether it's a resident or a migratory species. The harvest is regulated both by state and federal agencies. And then hunting is primarily by recreational hunters, but you also have other people that hunt for subsistence hunting or acquisition of food. So now that we have a basic and very brief understanding that wildlife belongs to the people, let's look at some of the threats that are emerging as far as wildlife privatization. To make sure that everybody is on the same page, wildlife privatization has been defined in numerous ways, and I just wanted to make sure that we all understood what we were referring to when we use this terminology. This is based on a book called Wildlife and Society that came out in about the past 6 years, and basically it's wildlife privatization boils down to either an individual or a group of individuals that tend to dictate control over waters or wildlife resources, and subsequently the state or the federal government, in this case the state, would be transferring ownership or the trust over to these private parties or these private individuals. And so there's two things that happen. First, the private individual will control that resource, and then the management and the trust goes to that individual. Another term that you often see, especially if you get into the scientific literature, is this term wildlife ranching, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. The way that it's generally defined, even though it is an ambiguous and vague term, is that it's basically the commercial utilization of wildlife species. On the axis right here, we have wilderness areas, and as you move from wilderness areas here to husbandry, you have this increasing intensity of management. Wilderness areas are those areas that are set aside. There's no motorized equipment or vehicles, very few roads, just as the name implies, are pristine areas. Then you have public lands. These lands are open to the public for hiking, recreation, also for fishing. You also have outfitters that will go and conduct some hunts or angling on those areas, and so therefore there is some wildlife ranching that occurs on there, because you do have some commercial utilization of these wildlife species. You have fee hunting that generally occurs on private land, where a landowner will charge a trespass fee to access these resources so that people can make use of this public resource. And then if you continue along this continuum, at the very end you have husbandry, where you basically have animals in captivity in large enclosures or high fenced enclosures that are small, and you have intensive management. One thing that is common with everything to the left is that all these involve wild animals, and for the most part they're free ranging, that they can maintain their natural migration and movement patterns. And on the right, we have husbandry, and as I mentioned, high fences, small enclosure, they're captive animals. And I'll be focusing primarily on husbandry and the privatization threat of these animals, even though this applies to all wild animals because of the current threat that we face in the state. There are numerous arguments that people can use to argue against privatization. The legal argument is fairly simple, the public trust doctrine. It's been set not only through numerous U.S. court cases, Supreme Court cases, but it also extends back to the Romans. The biological is also fairly easy to establish. You have the risk of disease, the spread of disease, especially when you have animals in confinement, large numbers, either disease among those individuals or out to wild populations. You have also the threat of genetic erosion, both for the individuals that are being artificially bred as well as for the wild populations, should these individuals escape. So those two, the legal and the biological, are fairly easy to grasp and to make an argument for. The ethical one is one that more recently has emerged into the scene, and it's basically revolving around the fact that just as humans find their identity in liberty and individual freedom, wild things find their identity as perceived by humans through their wildness. The last one is an argument that rarely has been made, but that's where I'll focus most of my attention today, because the other ones are fairly easy to establish and do not take too much time to grasp. So this is a sociological argument against privatization, or the change in demographics that we're seeing across the United States. And there's two primary groups I'll focus on. One is professional, those individuals involved in the field of conservation, whether as private consultants or as academics or in other capacities, and then also just the general public. There was a survey that was done of the Southeast Deer Study Group meeting about 5 years ago, and this is an organization that basically encompasses all the Southeast states, of which Texas is included. And this meeting was held in San Antonio. They moved this meeting all throughout the Southeast, just happened to be in San Antonio. And there was a group of researchers from North Carolina State University that decided to survey these professionals to see what their feelings were, or their attitudes were towards certain management practices. There was a total of 400 registrants, but 200 participated in the survey, and here you can see the spread of their affiliation. You have pretty good representation from state, academic, private, smaller percentage of federal employees. As far as residency, where these biologists or these professionals came from, most of them were from Texas because the meeting was in San Antonio, but you also had good representation from other states. About 40% of the registrants or the participants were from other states. And they were asked a series of questions that dealt specifically with deer management, but as we'll see, they tie into this idea of husbandry and privatization. They were asked to rate each one of these questions, and there was many more, I'm just showing you a handful here, from 1 being strongly opposed, all the way to 5 being strongly support, and 3 being in the middle, that they had no strong feelings. And so as you can see, when you look at the pen, do they agree with the statement of pen breeding of captured deer? You have strong disapproval, 70%. The translocation of breeding deer within a state, 75%. This increased to 90% disapproval whenever those deer were being transported across state lines. Artificial insemination also drew fairly strong disapproval, 80%. And the cloning of deer was the highest disapproval. As you can see on the mean, this is just the mean response. Remember, 1 is strong disapproval, 5 is strong approval, 3 is neutral. So most of these, all of these were in the disapproval column. There's a few other questions that they were asked. Vaccination of deer, still strong support against the practice, 65%. Treating of deer for worms was 60%, roughly. Selling of breeder deer and male semen was about 80% disapproval, as was the selling of fertilized females. Again, if you look at the mean, all of them were below 3, 3 being neutral. They didn't feel strongly either way, but below 3 being strong opposition. So again, for these practices, these professionals were not seeing it appropriate to engage in these deer management practices. Last set of questions that I'll include here. There were many more in the survey. Predator reduction, now we see that the support is switching. It's no longer disapproved, but it's now there's showing support for these practices. 50% approval for predator control. What's interesting is that whenever you look at food plots or food in general, the approval starts to decrease the more intensive the practice. So for providing food plots, it's 80%. For seasonal supplemental food, you have about 50%, and for year-round, it's about 40%. So the more intense the practice, that approval rating by these biologists and professionals tended to go down. Providing supplemental feed also was about 60%. So if you look at the mean, remember 3 being neutral, above 3 being more stronger support, we can see that now for these practices, they're starting to support these practices. And if we were to look at some of these questions where they fell, we'll notice that those questions that were strongly disapproved, like the cloning of deer, the translocation of breeding deer, selling of male semen or fertilized females, they all received very strong disapproval, and they were all in the husbandry category. Those practices that were strongly favored included more natural processes, or at least population management processes such as culling of males, providing feed or predator reduction, and they fell under that population or habitat management. And so with the authors of this study, they said, well, we know how they feel individually about each one of these questions that overall deal with husbandry. How do they feel about husbandry in general? And so now the scale was no longer from 1 to 5, but for every question, they kept adding points. So if somebody was strongly against cloning of deer, that would be a 1. If on the next question they were strongly against the translocation, that would be another 1. And so now the scale ranged from about 1 to 30 because you're adding all these points either in favor or against. And here is what it looked like, and they had the foresight to partition this by those individuals, those professionals that were in the private sector, which is the first 2 bars. The first bar is for Texas, and the others for other states, but these are private individual or private consultants. The next 2 bars are for those that are in state agencies. This is for Texas state agency personnel. This is for other states. And then the last are universities. It can be faculty or graduate students. The first thing to take away is that all of them collectively, whenever they looked at husbandry practices as a group, everybody disapproved of it. However, there was a group, these bottom, they all showed common support, or disapproval, I should say, for this. There was one group that showed the greatest support, and those were the private consultants. And this tended to show 2 things. One is that husbandry and those practices that are associated with husbandry, in general, they tend to be value driven. What is your value? Should these practices be applied or not based on your values? But they're also interest driven. The only group that showed the strongest support was a group that was going to be more impacted economically by these practices should they be adopted. And that was just for the Southeast Deer Study Group meeting. What about other organizations such as the Wildlife Society? I won't go through their position statements, but both the Wildlife Society has a position statement. It's the largest North American organization of wildlife professionals. It goes from Canada into Mexico, and they basically say they recognize that there's serious biological and genetic and social threats to the privatization, confinement, and ungulates, and that they oppose any attempt to privatize wildlife. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, AFWA, the International Association, they also support the public doctrine, and they're pushing to maintain and educate the public towards it. So we see from the professional community strong opposition against privatization of wildlife. What about the general public, those that are not educated in education and have their careers in other disciplines, in other areas? There was a survey that was done of Texas residents, and this focused down in the Rio Grande Valley. And they went around and they asked people their attitudes towards whether wildlife should be a public resource or a private resource. Just to give you a brief breakdown of the participants, about half and half female, even though males tended to predominate. Because it was the Rio Grande Valley, close to the U.S.-Mexican border, Latinos tended to predominate, and there were 6% Caucasian. They looked at the support of public or private ownership of wildlife in relation to where they come from. Urban settings were any town that was greater than 250,000 population. Rural was any town that was smaller than 5,000. And town was in between. And the basic trend that you can see here is that the more rural that you become, the perception tends to drop or the support tends to drop as far as whether wildlife should be public or a private resource. So they're being asked, do you think that wildlife should be a public resource? About 80% of them that lived in urban centers said yes. It's still pretty large for rural, pretty close to 50%, but you can see that the more rural the individual, the less that support for a public resource. What about the size of the property that they own? And so you had everybody from they didn't own their property or the home that they lived in, to small residential, which was about the size of an acre, to large residential, which was from about 1 acre to about 65 acres, and agricultural. These were properties that were larger than 65 acres and all of them were farmed. And basically what you can see is that the larger piece of property that you own, usually you tended to have less and less support of wildlife being a public property. For those that lived and owned small properties, you still had 50 to 70%. But what is interesting is that we see that as property size increases, the support for wildlife being a public resource decreases. But the real interest is that it was mediated by ethnicity. And what I mean by that is that if you were a Latino or of Hispanic origin, it didn't matter. As the property size increased, they still tended to view wildlife as a public resource. And it was amongst Caucasians that as the property size increased, the support for wildlife being more of a public entity or a private entity increased. The way you interpret those R squares, basically it just gives you the strength of the relationship. If it's 0, it's a very weak relationship. There's no tie between those variables. If it's 1, it's a very strong relationship. It's a perfect relationship. So then you can see that for Latinos having property and the wildlife being private, there's a very weak relationship there. But for Caucasians, it's considered stronger. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you look at demographic trends in the United States, it probably doesn't come to a surprise to most of us that over time, the percentage of the U.S. population that lives in urban settings has been increasing, and the percent that lives in rural settings has been decreasing. Currently, we have about 80% of our population in the U.S. lives in urban settings, and roughly about 20% live in rural settings. What is important about this is recall that those people that come from urban environments tend to view wildlife more as a public resource and support that notion. So the country as a whole is moving more and more by the mere shift to urbanization in support of wildlife as a public resource. If you look at ethnicity, again, it probably comes as no surprise. Here we have in the 1960s, we have the Caucasians comprise about 85% of the population. Hispanics or Latinos comprise about 4%. They're projecting that by 1960, or 2060 I should say, Caucasians are going to comprise about 40% and Hispanics about 30%. The reason that that's important is, again, remember that Hispanics tended to favor wildlife as being a public resource, independent of whether they own property or not. And in particular, if they own property, they still viewed wildlife as a public resource. So we looked at where the individuals lived at and also their ethnicity. What about the general public in the U.S.? What the research shows is that in general, the public or the general public is okay with hunting and the generation of revenue by the sale of hunting licenses. They really have no objection or no disapproval of this practice. Where that disapproval comes in is the intent behind hunting. If the intent is primarily for trophy or solely on trophy, they have major opposition. But if it's for either recreation or the acquisition of food, they're more unfavorable. Recall that in those confined or husbandry situations, the primary purpose is trophy animal production and hunting. And so you would see a general shift away of support from the general public if this practice was implemented and pursued in privatization. And lastly, I'll conclude my talk by looking at the role that private landowners play in this debate of who owns wildlife. Private land comprises about 60% of the total U.S. land area. And by default, it also houses many of the ecosystem services and goods that are important for human civilization as well as housing much of our biodiversity. Now, the general argument that has been made for private property is that these landowners, if wildlife have value, landowners will conserve them, they'll manage them. In the process, they'll conserve the habitat, and many other species will be benefited, those that are non-game species and even that have little economic value. Now, that's been the hypothesis, and it's been a good rationale. It makes sense. If wildlife have value, people are going to conserve it, other species will thrive from it. But there had been very little data on this, and people usually would poke holes at this. It sounds nice logically, but where are the data? Well, this study just came out. I'm glad that it came out when it did. It just came out a month ago when Fred asked me to give this presentation. And here are some data on this question of how important private land ownership is in wildlife recreation. So on the first graph that we see there on the left, it's the total U.S. land area. And you see that 22% of the land area that is managed for wildlife is private land. Private land comprises 60% of the U.S. land area, so roughly about a third of all private land is currently being managed for wildlife recreation. It could be angling, wildlife watching, hunting. And you see that hunting comprises, of that 22%, most of that land is being leased or owned for hunting, with a smaller fraction being for wildlife watching and even a smaller fraction for fishing. So still, we have about 20% of our land surface area in the U.S. is being managed for hunting and for fishing and for wildlife watching by private landowners. These graphs I had to take directly off the publication, so they might be a little bit difficult to see, but you can see the overall trends. So the first graph is for anglers, the middle graph is for hunters, the bottom graph is for wildlife watchers. On the x-axis, you have property size, so these are small properties, less than 50 acres, medium-sized properties from 50 to 1,000 acres, and then large properties greater than 1,000 acres. And this is just how much funds are being spent either in ownership or in leasing of private land for wildlife recreation. And really the take-home message is that anglers and wildlife watchers, they tend to focus on smaller properties, but really hunting tends to focus on large-sized properties for their leasing. As far as total acreage, the angling community and the wildlife watching community doesn't compare. Really, most of the land and large chunks of land are being leased or owned for hunting or by hunters. And what was really interesting to me is that if you look at the percentage of ranches and farms that are participating in wildlife recreation income, I know it's hard to see, but the scale goes from about 50-acre sized properties all the way to greater to 50,000. And what you can see is that the larger properties, about 40% of ranches or farms that are greater than 50,000 in the U.S. are being used for wildlife recreation or are participating in this generation of wildlife income. This is not to say that small properties are not important. They are important. However, those large chunks of land are being maintained by hunting leases and hunting ownership, or ownership for hunting. And so really this is a take-home message. For many, many years we have known in wildlife conservation that you need large continuous tracts of land to maintain wildlife. And generally we had seen that as a role of a private landowner, but we had no data. Now we're seeing that because wildlife have value, the private landowner is keeping these large properties intact, either leasing it out or they're being purchased for hunting. And so you're conserving these large chunks of land, not only for the animal that is important, whether it be elk or deer or whatever the case may be, but also for all the other species that are on there. But I think the most important one is this last point that you have here, is that landowners that obtain some kind of revenue from recreational hunting or recreational activities, they are more likely to participate in government sponsorship programs such as CRP or EQIP, but more importantly, they were more willing to invest their own dollars into management practices. And so how do we put all this information together? Really the question is, who owns wildlife? Or another way of saying that is, should wildlife be privatized? And I'll just go and try to summarize all the information that I presented here. So here we have on the bottom, we have public ownership, or we have private ownership. You also have on this bottom management intensity, where in public ownership you have very low management intensity. Animals are basically managed as free-ranging wild populations. Here on the private side, you have high management intensity, high fences, small enclosures, vaccinations, artificial insemination, bottle feeding, etc. You also have wild free-ranging animals on the public side, and you have captive animals on the private side. Now let's look at the social ecological factors and which way are they tilting as far as towards public ownership or private ownership. If you look at wildlife health, it's fairly easy. Animals that are free-ranging are at less risk of wildlife diseases or contracting diseases than those animals that are held in captivity. What about the demographic shift that now most of the population in the United States is in urban settings? Again, the more urban that you come from, or the more urban the environment in which you come, the stronger support for public stewardship of these resources. We're having an increasing population of minorities, specifically Hispanic. That group also is favoring public ownership of wildlife. The non-hunting community, they tend to favor hunting whenever it's done either for the acquisition of food or for recreation, but they tend to oppose it whenever it's for trophy, which tends to be more with a captive and a husbandry setting. And then lastly, the role of private landowners. Land is being leased and is being owned primarily in those large chunks of land, which would again correspond to more wild free-ranging animals. So whenever we see, and we have to ponder this question of whether wildlife should be privatized, we just have to look at this graph to show all the ecological, the legal, the demographic processes that are really going to be against the entities if they do propose a private ownership of wildlife. And then lastly, I'll leave you with this quote by Teddy Roosevelt. Shane Mahoney mentioned it. It's too small for y'all to read, so I'll read it for you. It says, "Here's your country. Cherish these natural wonders. Cherish the natural resources. Cherish the history and romance as a sacred heritage for your children and your children's children. Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance." Thank you.
Okay, we'll have one more speaker before break. And
2 minutes.
yeah, about 2 minutes break. Okay. I encourage my good friend Bob Brown to come from North Carolina over here from Texas and talk about his experience in North Carolina. He, the Pennsylvania native, he got his PhD at Penn State. He was a scientist at the Cesar Claiborne Institute in the early days, up until 1987 or so, as I'm remembering. Then he went to become department head at Mississippi State in Fish and Wildlife Science, then at A&M in Fish and Wildlife Science. Then he became dean of the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State. He's past president of the Wildlife Society, the organization we talked about. He's my friend and professional member of the Boone Pocket Club, and I think his greatest honor, I would say, is he spent 24 years in the Marine Corps and served in active duty in both Vietnam and Desert Storm. So please help me welcome Dr. Bob Bryant.
You're going to wish I had Fidel do my slides. I'm going to wish I had Fidel do my slides. Thank you for inviting me here. I appreciate that. It's good to be back in Texas among old friends. It's good to be back among young friends, too. Most of my friends are getting to be my age. I was asked to come here today to talk about the battle over deer farming that we fought over the last couple of years in North Carolina and lost, unfortunately. And I'm going to have a lot of slides here, if we can find them. Yes, there they are. With a lot of detail in them, and I apologize for that. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. Which one moves the slides? The right one. Thank you. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, and I apologize for the detail, but the fact of the matter is when it comes to a political issue and or a legal issue, the devil really is in the details, and so that's why I'm going to go into that to some extent. And again, as Fidel mentioned, we all have some difficulty defining what we're talking about here. I use the term game farming to describe facilities that raise game animals for venison or for hunting. Now, there are states in the U.S. that allow raising white-tailed deer for venison, okay? Other places, such as we have in North Carolina now, raise deer for hunting, but we don't hunt the high fences in North Carolina, so they're selling them to someone else, which I call a game ranch. So a place that's set up for hunting game behind high fences. Captive service really applies to both. Now, what happened in North Carolina prior to 2002, we had no regulations concerning captive deer whatsoever. We did not allow hunting behind high fences and still don't, except on the Cherokee Indian Reservation, where the state has no authority at all. How did deer get behind high fences in the first place on these deer farms in North Carolina? Well, the Wildlife Resources Commission, they're also over freshwater fisheries, by the way. We have 19 commissioners, by the way, a lot of folks. Anyway, the commission had a program where if they found somebody turned in an orphan fawn, or what they thought was an orphan fawn, they'd give it to somebody and they could build a pen in their backyard and raise it. Some people fenced their land, high fences, and naturally the deer that was within that land. And then some started importing native and exotic deer. So in 2002, the Wildlife Commission, the biologists, did a survey and found there were something over 100 captive deer facilities in North Carolina. Of course, this is small potatoes compared to what goes on in Texas. So they recommended some regulations, and the legislature passed them in 2003. That there's an operational protocol on how you can handle animals. There'd be semi-annual inspections of the facilities. They're allowed to sell the deer outside of the state. But because chronic wasting disease had become an issue around the United States, they were prohibited from importing animals or transferring animals between facilities within the state, and there'd be no new facilities until all the current facilities were declared chronic wasting disease free for 5 years, which would be in 2008. I assume everybody here knows what chronic wasting disease is. I'm not going to go into that. I do have a caveat to admit that CWD was first found in the research deer pens at Colorado State University in 1967. I was an undergraduate student working in the deer pens at Colorado State University in 1967. So I just never should have put those sheep with the scabies in the pen of the deer. That was my mistake. Let's go. The other thing they did in 2002 is the Wildlife Commission offered to buy people out. I honestly don't know how many deer were purchased, but the commission spent about $250,000. They euthanized all those deer, big mistake. But it did reduce the number of facilities from over 100 to 37, but they got a huge amount of negative publicity from euthanizing all those deer, as you might expect. So finally, 5 years comes along, 2008. All the deer farms in North Carolina have been free from CWD. There's none in the state, hasn't been for 5 years. But by now, CWD has spread over several states, and it's a much bigger issue nationally. So the commissioners decided, let's put this off for a while and think about it. So they put it off for a couple of years, and sure enough, a wild deer in Virginia, a neighboring state, was found to have chronic wasting disease. Our governor at the time, in 2011, Governor Perdue, appointed a captive cervid task force to discuss all this stuff. It never met. I was on that commission, it never met. And the governor was replaced shortly thereafter with Governor McCrory. But by 2012, now it's been 10 years that these deer farms have been free of CWD. They still can't transfer between each other. They can sell deer outside the state, but they can't import any. And so they put pressure on the Wildlife Commission. Now it's been 10 years. Let's get some stuff going here where we can have more deer pens, expand the ones we want, the ones we have, and bring deer into the state. Well, that's the year that chronic wasting disease was found in both pens and wild deer in Pennsylvania, a state that had the exact same regulations that we were about to adopt. So Governor McCrory appointed the Chronic Wasting Disease Task Force, and I served on that as well. This was a group of about 20, roughly 20 people, including the director and his staff. They brought in the national folks from the Deer Farmers Association and the State Deer Farmers Association. There were 2 or 3 deer farmers. We only have 2 or 3 commercial deer farms in North Carolina. I'll get to that in a minute. Some of the professionals here know Joe Hamilton from QDMA. He attended all the meetings. I was there. We also have 2 former directors of the Wildlife Commission who work for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and they were there. APHIS was there, the state veterinarian. It was an open meeting, so we also had people, representatives from the Farm Bureau, from the Department of Agriculture were there. Some of you know John Fisher, who's probably the country's top CWD biologist. He's with the, what they call the Southeast the Wildlife Disease Study Group at the University of Georgia. He came to every one of our meetings. And we brought in people from Pennsylvania, from the Wildlife Commission there, as to what had happened in Pennsylvania. We'll note here that there's a change in title from the Captive Cervid Task Force to the CWD Task Force. So we weren't allowed to talk about things like ethics, like public trust doctrine, private ownership, things like that. We only could discuss chronic wasting disease. Over a period of about 2 months, we had 3 8-hour meetings. We started, the staff, some of, again, the professionals here, they know David Cobb, who's chief of big game in North Carolina, top-notch guy. His staff are top-notch. They started out by providing about 300 pages of information for us. Maps of CWD in the U.S., the captive cervid rules in every state, including North Carolina, the North Carolina's CWD response plan, should we ever get a case in the state, USDA's herd certification program. Some of you know Dr. Deere, Jim Kroll and Don Davis at A&M, very pro-deer farming people. They've had a video that some of you may have unfortunately seen, and so we saw that. And as these meetings went along, we asked for more information, and David Cobb and his staff provided another 300 pages roughly. So I have about 600 pages of information on chronic wasting disease. We could have a whole course on this stuff. Naturally, one of the things we talked about was the economic impact in North Carolina. Now again, this pales in comparison to Texas. But at any rate, we've got about 280,000 deer farmers that produce about 8,300 jobs. They provide about $46 million in taxes through their activities. And this is an old number, but 2006, about $820 million in economic impact for deer hunting. Compared to deer farming, okay, I mentioned we have 37 deer farms. 24 have less than 10 deer. I've got somebody on my Wildlife Federation board that has 1 deer. He's one of those 37 deer farmers, okay? Only 2 farms have over 50 deer. Altogether, this is as of about 2 years ago, we only had about under 800 animals altogether, 240 whitetails, 460 exotics, 75 elk. And of course, the income from the deer farms is proprietary, but we guess something less than $2 million compared to the $820 million that the deer hunters bring in, or have an impact in. The state, of course, does CWD testing. The facilities are required to pay inspections is about $72,000. And in the CWD testing they've done, now this is mostly on hunter-killed deer, about $125,000. And there are about 4,000 hunter-killed deer tested and all were negative, so we don't have it in the state yet. These were used for projections as to what if we did have a case and how much testing would cost if it went beyond that. Legal issues, it is in the North Carolina Constitution, the public trust doctrine. There's a whole page and a half on wildlife and how they're owned by the public. It specifically forbids private ownership or sale of native wildlife, dead or alive or in parts. But there's a line down at the bottom, a caveat, with exceptions provided by the Wildlife Commission. And of course, like you, and like just about every state in the U.S., we've unfortunately set a precedent. We allow people to raise pheasants, quail, some waterfowl for hunting, also for sale to restaurants. In North Carolina, we allow the purchase and sale of coyotes and foxes for hunting or for dog training. So unfortunately, we opened the Pandora's box with those kind of decisions some time ago. As far as the outcome of the task force, we really didn't have one. We couldn't agree on anything much. We said, yeah, if they increase the fines, that would be okay. The deer farmers said, yeah, that'd be okay. And we shouldn't be importing deer parts from chronic wasting disease states. Yeah, they agreed to that. And the Wildlife Commission should quit giving out fawns when they find an orphan fawn. But at the end, there was no final report. Each member of the task force, 20 or so of us, were asked to send individual comments to the director. But those comments were never sent back to us, so I have no idea what other people there said, nor does anyone else. We don't even know if they were ever shared with the commissioners. So at the end, there was no report. So that all having failed, the Wildlife Commission then decided to have some public hearings. They had 2 pretty well attended. Again, pretty much the same people showed up and said the same things they said before. We were by that time, however, getting a lot of support, position statements and letters of support from the Wildlife Society, QDMA, Boone and Crockett, Pope and Young, the Elk Folks, the Wildlife Federation, AFWA, that's the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the Texas Wildlife Association. The WRC had an internet survey as to people that were for or against this expansion of deer farming and transfer of regulation to the Ag Department and so on. 2008 people voted against, 8 voted for. Although one of the commissioners told me, well, those 2008 probably all belong to your Wildlife Federation, so that counts as one vote. At the same time, we are all well aware that in West Virginia, the state director lost his job by opposing the expansion of deer farming in that state. Also in Missouri, they passed a law expanding deer farming, and the governor vetoed it, and then the legislature went after the funding of the state wildlife agency. So those are top in our heads, certainly top in the commissioners' heads when they're thinking about this sort of thing. Well, in 2014, Representative Roger West, who's chair of the Ag and Natural Resources Appropriations Committee, he's involved with the 2014-15 budget, and so he slipped into that budget the transfer of regulatory authority from the Wildlife Commission to the Department of Ag and Consumer Sciences, or Consumer Services. Also in there, it classified captive service as farm service, a new terminology that we've not heard before, but we assume that means that they are to be considered livestock, which of course changes the whole thing. Both the Wildlife Commission and the director of the Wildlife Commission and director of the Ag Department, knowing who put this in, and he's the chair of their Appropriations Committee, naturally they agreed with this. This is just fine, we'll go along with it. We won't fight it. Even though at least the director, Steve Troxler of the Ag Department in North Carolina, Secretary of Agriculture, said, I didn't ask for this, but we'll accept it. Well, they got a big backlash from all sorts of conservation and hunting groups. And so what they did pass is that they would allow importation, regardless of CWD or anything else. Deer could be imported effectively July 1st, 2017, no matter what. Also in there is the Wildlife Commission may issue new facility permits. The commission, at least its director and their lawyers, read that as they have to issue new permits, and they did issue 2 new permits. We argued that said may, it doesn't say you have to, but they did. Also that the state cannot have higher standards than the USDA concerning testing on CWD. At the time, we did have higher standards than the USDA standards. And they can allow the sale of parts, antlers, velvet, hides inside and outside of the state. And just to drill this home to the commissioners, their director, the Wildlife Commission director and the chair of the commission had to report to the Ag and Forestry Awareness Study Commission. This was a new commission they established as to how and why their previous CWD standards differed from those of the USDA. And after they got beat up over that, there was also another committee put together, and the two were required to attend a meeting of the House Select Committee on the Regulatory Authority and Operations of the Wildlife Resources Commission. Basically, they got beat up just all day long. They were not allowed to respond. No one in favor of anything the Wildlife Commission has done was allowed to speak. They got beat up over not just deer farming issues, but anybody that had a gripe. Somebody's cousin got picked up for too many fish or too many deer or hunting out of season or whatever. Anybody that wanted to complain about the Wildlife Commission got to speak, and the director and the chair of the commission could not respond, nor was anybody asked to say anything in favor of them. So they were just driving home the point that you mess with us, we'll come and get you. So we get to January 2015, the new legislature comes into session. Senator Brent Jackson, the President Pro Tem of our Senate, introduced the 2015 Farm Bill, which goes along with the budget, but is not necessarily part of the budget. But in there are deer farming provisions that would replace what Representative West had put into the budget previously. One was to transfer all regulatory authority from the Wildlife Commission to the Department of Agriculture, allow for new facilities and expansion of current facilities, not having any testing requirements greater than the USDA, and allowing sale and transport of deer and products within and outside of the state. The one good thing that they put in is that there could be no importation of cervids allowed until the USDA approved a live animal test. And I know there is some live animal testing going on here in Texas, but it's not, as far as I know, it's not approved for transferring animals between states, or at least into North Carolina thus far. No doubt it will be at some point. So that started in January when the legislature started. Was put in as a bill. We had a major sponsor or hero or leader of our group, Representative Jay Adams, a well-known hunter from Catawba County in North Carolina, also a nationally recognized pistol shooter and so on. But he took up the anti-deer farming cause, and I have to give this man tremendous credit. He literally devoured all 600 pages of information, everything we had, met with us many times, and went around the House and Senate spreading the word that this is bad legislation and we need to beat it. We did come before the House Ag Committee. He put in a motion to remove the deer farming provision. Everybody got to speak, the deer farmers, I was able to address them and so on. And it was defeated by a voice vote. I was there in North Carolina in committee meetings, legislative committee meetings. They can take votes by voice vote, and it's up to the chair to decide who won and who lost. And in this case, it sounded at worst a tie for that we may have won, but nobody challenged it. Once the chairman says that's it, the deer farmers won, it's all over, at least in that committee. Fortunately for us, the legislature couldn't agree on a budget by their July 1st deadline, and so this went on all the way to September. Public reaction, again, we had a couple of lobbyists that worked for us, or lobbyists for other organizations. The Southern Environmental Law Center, for instance, was one, and Representative Adams and his friends going door to door in the legislature. We have a subgroup of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation called the Camouflage Coalition. It's about 5,000 hunters, and so we sent out the word via social media, and they started sending in phone calls and emails and letters to their congressmen saying you got to stop this. We had op-ed articles in the various newspapers. We took out full color, full page newspaper ads in the Raleigh paper and the Charlotte papers. Interestingly, 5 county commissioners' courts, we have 100 counties in North Carolina, 5 county commissioners' courts actually passed resolutions that they would not allow deer farming in their counties. A number of hunting clubs got involved, passing resolutions and writing letters and things of that nature. So there's a big public backlash. Not that it mattered, as it turns out. The budget was finally passed on September 20th, 2015. Now, once the budget passed, then all the other bills that have been considered all year have to be passed within the next 2 weeks. So there were 600 bills on the docket. Now, all these have been discussed. They were all put in January for the most part, and so the legislature had all year to debate them. So it's not a matter of really debating things much. They just go bing, 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 up, down votes, and it's all done. Except for the deer farming provisions of the Farm Bill. We really held up the entire legislature. By then, Texas had its blow up with chronic wasting disease here in your state, and we naturally publicized that a lot. There was this deer smuggling operation between, I think it was Ohio and Florida and Georgia. Fish and Wildlife Service fined these guys $1.6 million. So it was in a lot of the papers and so forth. We played that up. However, the power on the other side of the aisle, the other side of the issue, against Senator Brent Jackson, the President Pro Tem of our Senate, and Tom Smith, who was one of the 2 deer farmers that had more than 50 deer. He's a multimillionaire, former CEO of Food Line grocery stores, which are big in the South and in eastern states. And they went door to door and lobbying for the deer farmers. It was actually kind of interesting. They would literally come out of one office as we were going in, or we were going in, and they'd be right behind us, whatever. For maneuvering within the legislature, it bounced around between the House and Senate Rules Committees, Transportation Committee, Finance, Ag, Appropriations, and I was able, both the deer farmers and I was able to address all those committees as well as the Republican caucus and the Democratic caucus in both the House and the Senate. A lot of talks. It never went before the Wildlife Committee. If it had, it'd been dead in a heartbeat. But this is because it was in the Ag Bill. It was not in any Wildlife Bill. This was put into the Farm Bill, something we need to remember. So the votes finally came in September. On a Friday, the House voted 88 to 13. We have 120 members of our House, 88 to 13, against the deer farming provisions of the Farm Bill. We celebrated all weekend. We thought we won. For reasons I never understand, some of these bills have to be voted on twice, so that was considered the first hearing. We came back on Monday, they voted again, more people showed up this time. Now the vote was 99 to 13 in favor of removing the deer farming provisions of the Farm Bill. The same day, the Senate voted 44 to 4 against. That was a surprise. We didn't know that was coming. Naturally, then that went to a conference committee, the House and the Senate. I think the Senate got to put in 3 members, the House 4 members. The Speaker of the House, the President Pro Tem of the Senate appointed those. They were all pro-deer farming members of the legislature. This all occurred within about certainly less than 2 hours, maybe even less than 1 hour. This committee met for something like 30 minutes. It came back with a full Farm Bill with those provisions in it. Now the entire House and Senate have to vote for the entire Farm Bill. They couldn't pick out one part or another. So naturally, our supporters came back to us and said, we can't vote against the whole Farm Bill. We've got chicken farmers or soybean farmers or whatever in our district. We can't vote against the whole Farm Bill. So the final vote was, the bill was approved with the deer farming provisions, 70 to 44 in the House and 44 to 2 in the Senate. Why did this happen? Well, clearly, as I mentioned, the wildlife commissioners were afraid of losing funding because a good portion, and I wish I had that in my head right now, but I don't, a good portion of their funding comes not from license fees, but from the state legislature. The director was afraid of losing his job, like the one in West Virginia lost his job. Again, the laws were put in the Farm Bill and did not come before the Wildlife Committee. And the House and Senate leadership, lobbyists, again, we think there's maybe 2 or 3 commercial deer farms in North Carolina. They had more lobbyists than that. They had 5 or 6 lobbyists, more lobbyists than deer farmers. All the influence of our 280,000 deer hunters, the conservation groups, all the support from around the country had no impact whatsoever. In fact, if you think about it, I don't know how much money Tom Smith spread around in the Senate and the House, but strategically, he only had to influence 1 and maybe 2 people, the President Pro Tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, because they control, particularly the Senate. The reason the House voted pretty much in our favor first time around, and the Senate against us, is that the President Pro Tem of the Senate has a real grip on those senators. If you don't vote the way he votes, your legislation is never going to come up. You're never going to get appointed to a committee. And the House is a little weaker than that, but when the conference committee was appointed, naturally they were all pro-deer farming. And so when it comes to financial support of campaigns for legislators, you only had to give money to 2 people to control the whole thing. What should we have done differently? It would have been better if the Wildlife Commission received less funding from the legislature and got more of their money from fees and so forth, so they'd be less influenced by the legislature. I do think it's important that we educate the public and interest groups about the public trust doctrine. Last night at dinner with Shane and John, we talked a lot about the various school programs, 4-H, Boy Scouts, FFA, whatever, the Safari Club and with the Green Wing Teal thing, and Ducks Unlimited and the Turkey folks. Everybody's got these youth programs, and they all emphasize the public trust law, and that's good. But in this case, it wouldn't have mattered at all. It didn't matter what the public thought. My feeling is that we should form hunter conservationist super PACs to financially support leading legislators. This was done with money, and I suppose a lot of legislation gets done that way. In fact, don't quote me on this, but I know and support your campaign. And it would have been done, I think. Now, as far as the situation in North Carolina, I've met with the state veterinarian, and actually the Commission is doing a pretty good job of monitoring and regulating the deer farms. Again, only 2 new ones have been permitted. I don't know if others have expanded. But they actually found that the Wildlife Commission wasn't doing that great a job. They have 31 veterinarians that work for the Ag Department. Only 1 works for the Wildlife Commission. And the Ag Department did get some additional money and a couple new positions to do this. Interestingly, this year, we have a long session and a short session in alternate years. This year, the deer farmers came back and they slipped in a bill wanting a tax on deer feed. And that tax, I think it's 4%, would go back to the Deer Farming Association for their own lobbying activities and so forth. So a lot of ag groups have that kind of thing, the horse people do and so on. But it was on all deer feed, not just the deer feed going to the deer farm. So all the corn that was produced, that was bought by deer hunters for bait, the deer suckers, the salt blocks, it was going to be on everything. And fortunately, our representative, Jay Adams, caught that, and we did get that changed. Non-substantive things that happened, we did remind the legislature of the size and passion of the wildlife community. In fact, the president, the pro tem of the Senate, Brent Jackson, was quoted saying, "I never want to have to fight with those wildlife folks again." Well, wait till the end of this week. We've got something else coming up. We did make a lot stronger partnerships with a lot of other conservation organizations. That was good. We found a lot of legislative friends. Obviously, with a 99-13 vote in the House first time around, we have a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. And we improved our use of social media. This is the motto of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. We've got bumper stickers with this thing on it and all our cars. But the fact of the matter, it didn't matter, because every one of the people who voted for deer farming, it just made this time with another approach. And so maybe I have to talk about that during our question and answer period. Thank you very much.
All right, I don't want you to leave and don't come back after break, please. Susan Kibbe has great things to say. We're also going to hear from Ted Minkert with the Coastal Conservation Association. So this is more than deer. It's a more than deer issue, so please come back after break. Please take 10 minutes if you can, get it done. Come back. And, we'll pick it up with Susan Kibbe.